Welcome to What Healthy Couples Know That You Don't, a podcast dedicated to helping you create the relationship you truly want.
Low sexual desire and what to do about it. Interview with the wonderful Emily Nagoski. Welcome to Keeping It Real with Rhoda. Today I have the real pleasure of welcoming back one of my all-time favorite guests, Emily Nagoski. She was so excited to share her research-based information on improving sexuality for women. Episode 50 in 2018. Still worth listening to, if I do say so myself. I still remember the statistic Emily shared that 70% of women do not orgasm from intercourse. Though on TV, you would never know that was the case. Sexuality is such an important topic that so many people find it hard to talk about. I had a therapist in a workshop I offered tell me he never talked to couples about sex when I was super clear that that was not okay. Porn is easier to engage in than real live people. Sex is contaminated by awkwardness, shame, and lack of feedback from partners about what works and what doesn't. There are so many ways that talking about sex can be avoided, and yet it is talking about sex that can improve your relationship. Even if you both discuss sex and decide together to not pursue this path of pleasure, that's okay if it's decided together. One person deciding and two people never talking about it is really not okay. Sexual well-being can relieve stress and contributes to bonding with your partner. Yet it's so easy to give up and not even try to begin talking about it. It's the lack of communication about sex that is a real problem. So just two suggestions. I don't want you to take it personally that I've been different in bed, so let me talk about where I'm at. Or, we're not having sex as often, and I'd like to change that. How are you feeling about it? Both of those are very including statements, not blame or attack, that can really be helpful to greasing the wheels to a conversation beginning. It can't begin with accusations or a topic that's just ignored because unspoken resentments destroy relationships. It's the talking that matters. So here's some research. You know how I like doing that every episode. According to a national survey report from 2017, sexually satisfied partners are more likely to show their desire for partners, feel their desire for partners, reach orgasm in their sex life, and have a higher level of emotional intimacy, and hug outside of their sexual life. Frederick et al. In 2017, a well-conducted investigation by Anique Debrot and colleagues points to the surprising role not of the sex itself, but of the affection that accompanies sexuality between partners. Over a series of 4 separate studies, Debrot and her fellow researchers were able to pinpoint the way that everyday kissing, hugging, and touch between partners contributes uniquely to relationship satisfaction and overall well-being. And a statement from the Lancet on Public Health, June 2021, argues that sexual well-being is imperative to public health as a marker of health equity and a meaningful population indicator of well-being. Sexual well-being can be interrupted by so many obstacles: mismatched libidos, sexual dysfunction, infidelity, boredom, physical and emotional trauma, cultural differences, or mental health issues, and medications. All of these require communication, and some may require outside help. It can be work to create greater understanding that will nurture the sexual aspect of a relationship, which can lead to a more fulfilling connection between partners. One of my all-time favorite books to recommend to women is Emily Nagoski's book, Come As You Are, which helps individuals explore how the brake pedal and the gas pedal contribute to our sex life. I also tell people to watch The Principles of Pleasure on Netflix, where Emily is interviewed as an important science-loving sex educator. Her PhD is in health behavior with a concentration in human sexuality. She has a podcast titled Come As You Are, which, like this podcast, is in the top 1% globally. Her newest book, just out, is Come Together. Emily, so happy to have your effervescent self back as my guest.
I'm so excited to be back.
So let's begin with, what are the myths about the key to great sex over the long term, and what really is the key?
Yeah. So a lot of us are. Can I tell the origin story of this book?
Absolutely. Totally.
Because Come As You Are is my first book. I started writing it like 1 year after I got married. And you might think that thinking about sex and talking about sex and writing about sex and reading about sex all the time would be like super sexy. It's really not. I was so stressed out by the process of writing a book about sex that I lost all interest in actually having any sex with my newlywed husband. I finished the book. Things got better. Then I went on book tour and things got a lot worse. Like, I would follow my own advice. We're going to talk about responsive desire, where my advice to couples is, sometimes you don't wait for the mood. You show up, you put your body in the bed, you let your skin touch your partner's skin, and often your body goes, oh, right, I really like this person. I really enjoy this. What a good idea. But I would put my body in the bed, let my skin touch my partner's skin, and I would cry and fall asleep, which is not ideal. Thank goodness I'm married to somebody spectacular.
He is. All his emailing back and forth. He is such a sweetheart.
He's a delightful human being. When I first started telling that story, people were like, wow, your husband must have been like really disappointed or really upset. And I was like, no, he brought me tea and left it on my bedside table for when I woke up. Like, no, he's a spectacular human being. But I was like, I need more advice than I give in Come As You Are. So I did what any good sex nerd does, and I went to Google Scholar, and I looked at the research on couples who sustain a strong sexual connection, people who have extraordinary sex, and what I found there completely contradicted like cultural mainstream narrative about sex and long-term relationships. Because among like social workers and therapists and other sex educators, there was sort of this conversation that either intimacy is the key to desire. You need closeness to keep the spark alive. Or people were like, no. Distance is the key to desire. You need just a little separateness to keep the spark alive. In desire, you need a bridge to cross. It turns out when you actually talk to people who have great sex lives in long-term relationships, they do not talk about desire. They don't talk about keeping the spark alive. So I'm not saying that spark is bad. I'm not saying that it's not a reasonable goal to have in your relationship. But if that's your goal, that is not the goal that people who have great sex lives have. Their goal is pleasure, whether or not you like the sex you are having. The couples who sustain a strong sexual connection over the long term are the ones who know that whenever they show up for sex, however often that is, however long it lasts, however many orgasms are or are not included in that process, they know they're really going to enjoy the experience. And when I say it out loud, it sounds so obvious, right? Because you're like, oh, it's not dysfunctional not to want sex you don't like. And yet, what is the number one reason couples seek sex therapy? Low desire, no desire, low frequency, no frequency, desire differential, one person wants sex more than the other one. People are really worried about desire. And I would love us to live in a world where people are really worried about pleasure. Do you like the sex you're having?
I agree. And sometimes the way I start into this with couples is I also talk about what are the ways you're having pleasure or fun separate from sex so that they can get comfortable. And it's amazing. And women individually, often they're so busy caretaking that pleasure is not forefront. And so I think that's one of the really delicious aspects of what you do. I do.
Yeah, and we live in America was founded by Puritans.
Yes.
Who left the UK because they felt like British people were too wild and wacky. And needed to behave themselves and be more disciplined.
I do think about that puritanical context, and it does weave its way insidiously in our culture. Yeah. I do think that.
And then you add capitalism on top of that and the idea that our productivity is a measure of our worth. And I can't stop and take time for pleasure. Then I won't have time to do all the things I need to do. And then you add the gender role piece. For women, it's I can't stop for pleasure. How selfish of me to spend time enjoying the sensations that are my body's birthright rather than giving myself to my spouse and my husband and my community and my family and all the rest of it.
The whole thing about it being a chore is something that I found exhausting trying to talk to people about, because it's pleasure is not a chore, and I think it's family of origin stuff. I certainly got no information. I actually learned a lot about sex starting in the incest program for Pittsburgh Action Against Rape in 1980 and talking to people about sex a lot. And that really kind of opened that door. And I feel grateful for that. But I think there's just something about this chore mentality as opposed to pleasure.
I actually have asked a few thousand people, what is it that you want when you want sex? And what is it that you don't want when you don't want sex? People's flippant, off-the-top answer for what they want when they want sex is often orgasm. But 95% of people can have an orgasm by themselves. And if you can't, there's whole books and workshops just about that. But so what is it that you want when you want sex with another person? And what is it that you don't want when you don't want sex with another person? By far the most common answer when people are like, what don't I want? I don't want to feel obliged. I don't feel like this is a requirement, like I have to.
Yes, that just like a puzzle piece went right into my head, and that is absolutely right. Yeah.
When you said chore, I was like, exactly, it's the frickin' dishes.
Yes, yep. Oh, my goodness. Yeah. All right. What are the 3 characteristics of partnerships that sustain a strong sexual connection?
Right. So I thought these were really straightforward when I wrote them. It turns out they're pretty controversial. Number 1, couples who sustain a strong sexual connection over the long term. 1, they are friends who admire and trust each other. It turns out, in particular among heterosexual people, there are those who genuinely believe that romantic love and friendship are mutually exclusive. That you can't desire someone you're friends with and you can't be friends with someone you desire.
Yeah, I think I even heard that in a workshop many, many years ago from somebody. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's the whole plot of When Harry Met Sally.
Yeah.
And maybe that's true for some people, but when you look at the research, it's very clear that the people who sustain strong sexual connections over the long term, and kind of why would you bother showing up for sex over and over again with someone you don't like? So, friends, turns out Yep, liking each other, admiring the person, trusting the person really helps a lot when it comes to sustaining a strong sexual connection. And if you don't like the person, of course you don't like having sex with them. Doesn't that just, I feel like that's common sense. It's not common sense for everybody. Second characteristic is they prioritize sex. They decide that it matters for their relationship, that they protect time and energy for doing this, let's face it, sort of wacky, silly thing that we humans do of like letting our skins rub together and licking each other's body parts and sometimes putting parts of our body inside somebody else's and letting somebody put parts of their body inside us. Like, why? Why would we do that when we could be watching Parks and Recreation, which is also fun? Right? Like, so they decide that they figure out that there's something that sex contributes to their relationship that is unique and worth prioritizing. The difficult thing about prioritizing pleasure, we were sort of talking about this already, is that it means you have to look at your calendar, which usually people have more stuff to do than they have time to do it in. And you have to be willing to make a choice about something you are not going to do so that you have the time and energy for pleasure to share with your partner. And the only way you're going to make that time and protect that energy is if it matters to you more than something else. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Many years ago, early on, I interviewed a gay male therapist, and that was really what he talked about was prioritizing sex comes easier to two men in a couple. And at that time, I mean, that was quite a while ago. And I really thought about that a lot and began to talk to people about, making it a priority. But it ends up in the bottom 15, because, well, I got to do this for the kids. I got to do that, right. Blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
Yeah, because that priority, it feels like a moral choice.
Yes.
Like, how dare you put, even for 1 hour a week, how dare you make sharing erotic pleasure with your partner more important than spending time with your children?
Yes. And that's the puritanical piece and the not paying attention enough to pleasure, because you're a happier, so to speak, person if you're enjoying your life separate from your kids. It counts. Yes.
And your kids benefit from you being happy.
Yes.
And from you and your partner liking each other.
And it helps kids to see connectedness, which I think spills over after sex works.
Yes. And to see that pleasure matters and that playfulness and joy matter, that it's not just about checking off all the things on your to-do list and shuttling each other from one obligation to another, but about pausing and savoring connection with each other. And the way couples connect with each other has got this like special, unique characteristic of being erotic. And like Peggy Ornstein, in her book Girls and Sex, I think in the conclusion, writes about having grown up with a mom who just embarrassed her so much when she was a teenager by talking about like how pleasure was important to her, and her husband gave her orgasms. Your dad is very attentive, and like pleasure really matters. And it was like when Peggy was a teenager, it was so embarrassing for her. But it meant that when she got to adulthood, she had that script in her head that her pleasure mattered, and it made sense that a partner would prioritize her sexual well-being in that relationship. So like, yeah, boundaries, of course, and also, like, embarrass your kids a little bit.
Yeah, I agree. I do. Was there anything else you wanted to add? Because you were...
third characteristic for couples who sustain a strong sexual... Number one, this is a pop quiz. Number one was they like each other. They're friends who prioritize... Second, they prioritize sex. 3, they stop following other people's rules about who they're like supposed to be as sexual people and how they're supposed to do a sexual connection. Because we all have been taught from very early on who we're supposed to be, especially as gendered sexual people. Who's supposed to initiate? What sexual behaviors are acceptable? What order those sexual behaviors are supposed to happen and how often they're supposed to happen. And we beat ourselves up when we don't conform to that other people's opinions. And we only believe we're doing okay when we're doing what we think other people believe we're supposed to be doing. The couples who sustain a strong sexual connection look at all that and are like, wait a minute. How about no? How about what if I construct a sexuality that is right for me and my partner and for who we are in this phase or season or moment of our lives with that? Because all those other people, they're not in this sexual relationship, so their opinions do not matter at all. So we're going to do what's right for us.
Yes. And I remember many years ago with a sex expert workshop talking and saying, I had a couple that focused, happened to be two women, focused on using vibrators. And he really was disdainful and said, well, they're missing out on how to have pleasure with your own body. And I felt chastised because I thought I had told them, whatever works is fine. I really felt chastised. Yeah. That is
like I don't feel bad at all about just being like, no, that's wrong. That is factually incorrect. That is a byproduct. That is an old hangover from cis heteropatriarchal misogynist frameworks of how women's sexuality works. Whatever gives you pleasure
works
is the thing you should be doing.
Yeah. Well, that's what I thought. But I did. I thought, well, I don't know, and he's the expert.
No, don't you know there's a right way to experience pleasure and a wrong way to experience pleasure?
Wow. When you say that, I can't tell you. It brings me right back to the shame I had in that moment. It really, I felt like a putz, And
what's happening in my mind is I am noticing you in that moment, feeling chastised.
Yes.
By this man,
yes.
And I want to step between you and psychologically, not in real life, but emotionally, I want to punch him in the nose.
I cannot believe how that just bam.
Because imagine how your clients would feel.
Yes, and I did not go back and say anything negative to them, by the way.
No.
I was
Good.
Okay,
Good.
I feel bad, but you know what? I did that. Oh, well. Something in me must have thought something.
How dare you validate their sexual pleasure?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, wow. And, I really did learn that from doing incest. My contribution was, don't assume it was all terrible. It is a terrible situation of powerlessness. However, some people, I had a 10-year-old, and she said, what my grandfather, when he put his mouth on my vagina, do married people do that? And I took this deep breath. I mean, this was 1980, okay? No books written about this. And I took a deep breath and I said, well, yeah, most people really like it a lot, but there's some people that don't. And she said, whew, I really liked it. And that, we have these preconceived ideas, and you can really increase the shame and the guilt. So that was my contribution. And I think it was important, but I got it from my clients. And certainly that wasn't true for everybody. But it's that fingerprint, which is what we're talking about. Sexual pleasure is a fingerprint, and that really matters.
Yeah. And the ability to distinguish between pleasure, desire, arousal, and consent. That's a situation where consent is not possible, but just because consent didn't happen, just because a person didn't want it to happen, doesn't mean their body's not going to respond.
Yes.
And it doesn't mean that the parts of their brain that respond to those things aren't going to be like, this is the first time I've ever experienced that, and there's something pleasurable about it, even when the context is deplorable.
Yes.
Pleasure can still happen. It's one of the things that is sort of agonizing about the complexity of sex is that a person in such an appalling context can experience pleasure when someone in a really spectacular, wonderful context can struggle with pleasure sometimes.
Yes.
Because our brains are really complicated.
There's just so much about complicatedness and not trying to simplify things, that it really context. And sometimes we just don't have enough time for the context of a situation. And, like even just saying, because of a pill that my husband's taking, scheduling sex is totally fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And people are like, oh, it takes away the spontaneity. Well, that might be nice if you're 30, but we're 71. It's not, we got to do what we got to do. And that matters.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but I'm busy. Anything that's not in my calendar doesn't happen. Things that are important to me, I plan out weeks, months, sometimes even years ahead.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
So if it matters to me,
yes,
it's going on the calendar.
That's right.
And I kind of feel like, yes, it's not spontaneous, but it is romantic.
Yes. And I love the distinctions you're making. Yes.
If we're willing to set aside time, there's a million other things we could be doing. What if we're like, no, nothing is going to get in the way of us spending this time just doing this peculiar, silly, fun, joyful thing that we do together. That's sometimes really important and sometimes just a fun, silly game. Nothing is going to get in the way. Nothing matters more in this window of time than that we spend this time together.
Yes.
Oh, so hot.
Oh. All right. Please share with my audience your garden metaphor and how sexuality is not about being broken or needing to be fixed. I love that.
Right. So, on the day you're born, it's like you're given a little plot of rich and fertile soil. And on that day, your family of origin and your culture of origin begin to plant seeds. Ideas about bodies and sex and gender and love and safety and pleasure. And they cultivate those seeds. And as you get older, they teach you to cultivate those plants. And so by the time you get to the adulthood, you have this garden of ideas about sexuality, and you have a set of skills for how to cultivate it. And some of us get really lucky and have a garden full of things that all we need to do is weed and harvest. And some of us get stuck with some really toxic shit in our garden, which is no fair because we didn't get to pick any of that stuff. We don't pick almost anything that we are taught about sexuality for the first couple of decades of our lives. But it is an opportunity, even though it's not fair. We can go row by row through that garden and make choices about what we want to keep and what we want to pull and throw on the compost heap to rot, so that we are cultivating a sexuality that we choose for ourselves. And every time we pull a weed of body self-criticism, a weed of sexual shame, we are weakening that plant so that my sister's plot, which is next to mine, and my mother's plot, which is next to mine, and yours, which is a little over here, and all of your family members, that plant is a little bit weaker in all of their plots too. I'm making it a little bit easier for them to pull the weeds of body self-criticism and sexual shame and all the other trash that we get taught before we're even born very often. And when it comes to a long-term relationship, early in a relationship, it's like you're going to visit each other's gardens. And you're like, do I like it around here? Hey, let me show you what I've done with the place. But eventually, you begin to cultivate a shared garden. Like you bring over your favorite things from their garden, and they bring over their favorite things from their garden. And hopefully, their thing doesn't strangulate your thing. And you hopefully don't accidentally bring over the body self-criticism and the sexual shame, but probably you do, because it's not like our parents planted those ideas on purpose. Some parents do. But very often, I mean, in my family, it wasn't like intentionally teaching me those things. It was just the stuff that got traipsed into their gardens when they were infants. And so it's the stuff that got traipsed into my garden when I was an infant. And I had to go through and pull it. And I have to, every few years, I have to go back and re-pull it. Because with body self-criticism, your body keeps changing. You learn to love this body. And then 5 years later, that body is different. And you got to learn to love this new body that you've got. So the process of cultivating a sexuality that's right for you is never about like, oh, you're doing it wrong or you're broken, but it is a living thing that has seasons and that you get to craft over years. Every day that you're alive is a day that you can cultivate and change and harvest from the garden.
Oh, I find that lovely. I really do. What is great sex?
It is, so basically, it's whatever gives you pleasure. But I want to recommend here, anybody who's even remotely science-minded, there's a great book by Peggy Kleinplatz and Dana Maynard called Magnificent Sex, which is about the optimal sexual experiences research. This group study interviews with dozens of people who self-identify as having extraordinary sex. And you're like, oh, okay, well, so what is that extraordinary sex life? And how do you get to be a person who has it? This book has those answers, but I want you to guess what the typical age is at which these research participants have their first experience of extraordinary sex.
I'm going to guess late 30s.
55.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. Which two things at the same time, right? Because you're like, 55? There's so much opportunity. Like, it's never too late. And also, it's like they went that long just having sort of kind of like mediocre sex. But the thing is, they found their way to what feels extraordinary to them. And that's the part that I focus on. Like, it's never too late. Because if 55 is the typical first age, the sort of the median, that means there's a lot of people for whom it happened later.
And when you think about couples being distracted in the 30s by raising kids, because I was going to say 40s as I was thinking about that, but that's also an issue. And the happiest decade, according to research, in anybody's lifetime is, Emily, do you know?
I don't know.
The 60s. And I think that's pretty fascinating all by itself. I don't know any more than that, but that I know.
47 and a half now, and I cannot tell you how much I'm looking forward to crossing over into like all I want is to be done with perimenopause. I just want it to be over.
Yeah.
Because there's this sort of like chaotic, it's often 10 years long, this like hormonal body chaos of perimenopause.
Chaos, yes.
And then it settles back down into something steady after menopause, and I just cannot, like, I'm so looking forward to it.
And there's something wonderful about after menopause that really it's like I'm a more settled person, you know, and it's really a nice time. I don't think we talk about that enough because everybody talks about the hard part.
Yeah. Should I be lucky enough to live that long? I hope so. Man, because there's sort of like two paths people can go on. They can get past menopause and be like, phew, I never have to worry about that sex thing ever again, which is fine. Or they can be like, oh, so all those rules I used to think I had to follow and all those ideas about who I was supposed to be, none of that applies to me. None of it ever applied to you. But it's like there's a freedom that comes with like aging out of the normative ideal.
And the responsibilities. Yeah, and the responsibilities, I think. That's really interesting. Yeah, I love that. Please talk about those who are not interested in having sex, and please share the great question to ask yourself when feeling this way.
Yeah. So there's a lot of reasons why a person would. And so when I ask these few thousand people, what is it that you want when you want sex? Some people's answers is I don't.
Yep.
And there's a lot of reasons. One reason might be that they're asexual. A misunderstanding about asexuality is it's a lack of desire for sex. It's a lack of sexual attraction. So people who are asexual maybe masturbate even regularly. They may have pleasurable sex with a partner. They just don't experience attraction. There's a great ace sex educator, Aubrey Lancaster, who compares having sex as an ace person who is not averse to sex and experiences sexual pleasure, but it's like Disneyland. It's not for everyone. And if it's not for you, like, you can go visit Disneyland sometimes. If your partner loves Disneyland, you can go to Disneyland with them sometimes. But, like, it's a lot. And you might want to stay, and you might not want to stay as long as they do. So asexuality might be one reason why you're like, it just feels like a lot. Another is that it feels like an obligation, expectation, or a demand from your partner. There is almost nothing that can more rapidly kill sexual interest than a sense that you are required to have sex. There are so many versions of how people try to make sex happen in their relationship because they believe they're supposed to want, have, and like sex. I talked to a woman who was in a long distance relationship. So she felt very strongly that when she and her partner were physically with each other, she really should be having sex, no matter how she felt. So she would go ahead and have sex, even though it was physically painful for her. And I was like, no, there's only one thing that I say is not normal, apart from lack of consent, and that is unwanted pain. That's like, there are effective interventions for most forms of physical pain that come with sex. If it's unwanted pain, talk to a provider. And even if it's not pain, even if it's just boring, or you're distracted, or you feel like you're doing it because you have to, even though you don't like it, what happens when you have sex that you don't like because you feel like you should be having sex is that your brain learns over and over again. Like, there was another couple who decided they were going to have sex at a certain frequency, regardless of how they felt about it, because they read that advice somewhere in a book. Oh my God. So they did. They had sex at a certain frequency, regardless of how they felt about it. And it just underscored for the lower desire partner that their pleasure did not matter. And it just over and over, like, I don't matter. My pleasure doesn't matter. My desire doesn't matter. What kind of sex I like doesn't matter. We're just doing this because it's a chore, because it's an obligation. It's a responsibility. It's my duty as a partner. And their marriage ended because of that. Because they tried to, like, make sex happen when they didn't want or like it. Rather than talking about, like, what kind of sex do you... The question, the replacement is, like, what is it that you want when you want sex? And also, what is it that you don't want when you don't want sex? Very often it's a sense of obligation. Sometimes it's pain. Sometimes it's like, I don't want to feel pressured to have an orgasm because you feel like I have to have an orgasm or else you didn't do it right. Right? That sort of performance demand. Or I don't want to feel like I have to get an erection or there's something wrong with you if my body doesn't respond the way you think it's supposed to respond. Or I'm just, what I don't want when I don't want sex is to know that I'm going to get less sleep because you wanted sex and I'm just so tired.
Absolutely. Yep. That made me laugh because that's absolutely the truth.
It's so real.
Yes, it is. It's very authentic.
Especially with perimenopause. Nobody warned me about the sleep.
My episode photo for our first interview was a picture of my car's brake and accelerator. Yes. What are some things that can activate our accelerator into wanting sex?
Oh gosh, there are so many things. So your own physical and mental well-being, probably number one. Number two, partner characteristics. And it's not just physical characteristics, though certainly it can be physical characteristics. It's their sense of humor. It's watching them from a distance do something that they're really good about. It's seeing that they have anticipated your needs. Like when they come home and they brought something for you, they thought about you when you weren't there. relationship characteristics. So again, this is admiration, trust above all, but really like liking each other, admiring each other, and being there for each other. Sue Johnson defines trust as, are you there for me? Emotionally attuned, emotionally responsive, and emotionally engaged. Are you there for me when I need you? Those are the relationship characteristics. There's also ludic factors. That's my favorite one. Ludic comes from the same root as the word ludicrous. It just means to play.
Oh.
So do you feel free to break rules, to play, to romp? So play is this very specific mammalian behavior. It's a universal mammalian behavior where people engage in these behaviors for fun because everybody likes it and there is nothing at stake. You got nothing to lose, so you feel free to try stuff. And if you make a mistake, it's just oops, and nothing has gone wrong, and nobody has lost anything, and your relationship isn't damaged. You just made a mistake. Oops, sorry about that. And you can continue on. That playful approach is like so important. And then in the list of things that can impact the accelerator, there's other life circumstances. And most of the other life circumstances are honestly going to be stuff that hits the brakes. So I'll talk about those in a minute.
Okay. Let's do breaks.
Yeah. So again, physical and mental well-being. Number 1, perimenopause. I've had long COVID. Like, sometimes your body just isn't up for it. Relationship issues. Partner characteristics. Ludic factors. You don't feel like you have permission to play. You feel like the stakes are high. Like if you do something wrong, something bad could happen.
Yes, I have somebody that talks about that quite a lot. Yes. Yeah.
And it's really just a matter of, oh my God, talking to your partner about like, I have this worry that I'm going to do something wrong, and that worry that I'm going to do something wrong is hitting my brakes and making it more difficult for me to like the sex that we have together. I want our sexual connection to be all that it can be. Mm-hmm. I want it to be a source of joy and pleasure and comfort and delight in our relationship, and this worry is really getting in the way. So I was wondering if I could ask for your help in trying new things and agreeing that if something doesn't go perfectly, it's going to be okay. That neither of us is going to have our feelings hurt, and that neither of us is going to judge the other person. And then there's the other life circumstances. Stress, money, school, work, living in a rapidly exploitative, late capitalist, cis, hetero, misogynist, patriarchy, white supremacy. Small things.
Yes, I agree. I do. Explain the mess of wrong-headedness, which you call the desire imperative.
Yes. So, again, the number one reason why couples seek sex therapy is desire differential, low desire, no desire, low frequency, no frequency. And this is this sort of narrative we have in our head of how sex in long-term relationships is supposed to work, where there's supposed to be this like spark at the beginning of the relationship where you like can hardly wait to get your hands on each other, and you think about each other all the time, and you do it all the time. And that lasts a while, and then your lives get more complicated and that goes away. And you have two choices. Either you can let your sexual connection drift away on the sea of your menopausal hormones and, you know, whatever they do in commercials, hold hands on the beach at sunset, and that's it for you. Or you can fight, you can spend energy, time, and money trying to keep the spark alive. And if you can't keep the spark alive, if you don't have that spark, you don't have anything worth having, right? So even couples who really enjoy the sex they're having believe there is something fundamentally and irreparably wrong with their sex life if they don't have that spark. And the deal, like when you look at the couples who sustain a strong sexual connection, they don't talk about spark. A lot of them don't have spark. Some of them do. It scrapes into the top 10 characteristics of great sex. Barely. But mostly, people who have great sex talk about really liking the sex they have. Authenticity, vulnerability, play, connection. Those are the characteristics of really great sex. And instead, we think it's about having spark. And spark is really, it's a red herring.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think red herring is absolutely true. It's really important. Yeah, because people do that, they like, well, I don't know how I feel about you, and they clutter it up.
They feel like if the spark is not the same as it was before,
then there's something
wrong with them. There's something wrong with their partner, or there's something wrong with the relationship itself if they don't feel spark. No, man, things just change.
There is a wonderful fiction book. I don't know if you have time to read fiction, but I really was moved by it. It's called The Light Pirate, and it's really about Florida sinking because of climate, and the people that live in this rural town, the people who stay and don't flee, and how they have to keep adapting to change and accepting the reality, the harsh reality, and finding their way through that. It is such a heartwarming, but it is about change, and you have to roll with things. Yeah. That's everything changes. It's the only thing.
But there is a whole chapter on change specifically for a reason. So the feelsy thing is, when I was close to the end of writing this book, a friend of mine died of cancer. And she was right around my age, mid-40s. And she had married her wife the same year I married my husband. And yet she and her wife had already reached their, till death do us part. And here I was writing this book about sex in long-term relationships. And I was really confronted with the reality that when you say those vows or when you commit to each other, you are not guaranteed abundant time with people. You are only guaranteed change. And it is the way you navigate that change together that characterizes the quality of your relationship overall. Which is why there's a whole chapter on here are the public health strategies for managing change and how to talk to each other, depending whether the change is a wanted change or a change that is foisted on you, acknowledging that the whole thing about a long-term relationship is your bodies are going to change, and what a privilege that is, and also what a hassle that is.
And how scary it can be.
It can be so scary.
My husband has a health problem. He just had his first tooth extraction, and I had to schedule one for drive back from a vacation to get mine next week. And it's just, there's this sense of vulnerability, and our physical selves are different, and we're clearly heading into that more difficult chapter of life, despite the fact we both exercise, etc. You rolling with it, and I think that's why I was so moved by that book, because it is about accepting, it is about looking, it is about not pretending.
Yes. Yeah. And the examples I gave of sex and disability were, I focused on couples who brought their disability into their relationship. They got together in their 20s, and somebody already had their chronic pain condition or their disability when they got together. So it's not necessarily just an aging thing, though it is an aging thing. But disability will come to all of us if we are lucky enough to live that long. And so being able to, like you say, roll with it, to this body that I have now, which is 15 years different from the body I had when I got married, is just as worthy of pleasure and erotic joy as that other body that was mid-30s. Good for me, mid-30s, great. And perimenopause and long COVID and all the rest of it later, like this body also deserves all that pleasure. And people sometimes ask, well, what if people aren't attracted to each other anymore? I find it is much more common that people stay attracted to each other if they still like each other.
That is absolutely true. I really believe that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like in heterosexual couples, after a child comes into the family, people get so worried about like the body changes that can happen to a person who has gestated a human. And I have attended a lot of workshops and conferences where they have like dad panels, and they always ask the dads, how do you feel about the changes that happen to your partner's body? And they're like, I don't care. She is still super hot. Hotter now than ever. And they mean it.
Yeah.
Like we can trust them.
Yeah.
And usually if you're not attracted to your partner, it's probably not because of any specific physical change that happened to your body. It's because when you look at them, you think about like all the unresolved conflict, bullshit, garbage that has sort of accumulated in the relationship.
Unspoken resentments is my passion right now with people.
Nothing to do with the shape of their body or how much hair is on their head.
That's absolutely the truth, no question. What is the measure of sexual well-being, or do you feel like you've said enough about that? Because I do think you've said a lot about how to go about it.
So, so I'm going to say it in the special way. Did you know that people believe you more when what you say rhymes?
No.
It's true.
Well, I love my grandchildren's books that rhyme more because they're more fun to read. Yeah. So that's interesting.
They remember it better.
So do say.
And they believe you more.
Okay.
Pleasure is the measure.
Oh.
Pleasure is the measure of sexual
yes,
well-being, right?
Of course.
It is not about how often you have sex. It is not. Please don't make yourself have sex you don't want or like. It is not about how often you have it. It's not about how many orgasms you have or what positions you do it in or with whom or where or what room. Or it doesn't matter except whether or not you like the sex you are having. If you enjoy the sex, then you are doing it right.
That's great. So do you want to explain the two types of desire, spontaneous versus responsive?
Right. So spontaneous desire is that mess of wrongheadedness I was talking about. It's the spark. And it absolutely is one of the normal, healthy ways to experience desire, where you're just walking down the street, you see a stray, sexy person, or you're sitting at lunch and you have a stray, sexy thought, and it sort of gives you... Erica Moen, who is the cartoonist who illustrated Come As You Are, draws it as a lightning bolt to the genitals. Just kaboom! You want it. It seems like it's out of the blue. So you take your kaboom to your partner, like, I got the kaboom. Do you wanna... and hopefully they have kaboom at the exact same kind of kaboom at exactly the same time, because life is simple and easy, I guess. But spontaneous desire, just wanting sex out of the blue, is 100% normal. Do not worry if that's the way you experience desire. You're fine. But it turns out there's another way of experiencing desire that researchers call responsive desire, because where spontaneous desire emerges in anticipation of pleasure, responsive desire emerges in response to pleasure. So this is the it was in your calendar. So you show up, you arrange the childcare, you throw the last of the laundry into the dryer, you take off your clothes, you put your body in the bed, and you let your skin touch your partner's skin. Now, at this point, I should mention that I was talking to some friends of mine. They had 7 academic degrees between them and 2 children under 5. And they were just like, out of curiosity, Emily, how do couples sustain a strong sexual connection? And I was like, well, so you put your body in the bed and you let your skin touch your partner's skin. And one of them, I swear, leaned away from the table and went, ugh. And I was like, okay, so your problem is not a lack of desire. Your problem is that you don't like the sex that is available to you. And that is so you got to fix that part before the desire is going to come along. But responsive desire functions when it's responding to pleasure. You get there, you touch your body against your partner, you talk and whisper and kiss and lick and stroke, and your body goes, oh, right, this is really good. This is a good idea. And like it's on the calendar, and even though there's a part of you that it's like exercise, right? Or like going to a party. There's a sex therapist in New Jersey named Christine Hyde who taught me this metaphor. She talks to her couples like, you say you're going to go to a party because your best friend invited you, and it's a party. Of course you say yes. But as the date approaches, you start thinking, oh, I'm going to have to arrange childcare. Oh, am I really going to want to put on my party clothes at the end of a long week? But you said you would go. And so you put on your party clothes and you show up to the party. And what happens? Most of the time, you have a good time at the party. If you're having fun at the party, you're doing it right. Right?
Yes.
The thing for me that was liberating about that was learning that other people have pre-party dread. I was like, but literally though, other people feel that way? Because I don't feel that way about sex. I only feel that way about parties. But it's also exercise. You're like, I know if I could just put on my shoes and go for that run or that bike ride, or like I know that I'll feel so much better and be so glad I did it. But just gotta put on your shoes and do it. And you'll be like, oh, this is really good. I should do this more often.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. Yes. I love that. I want to mention that 30% of women have clitoral labia adhesions. Mm-hmm. And doctors don't know enough about this problem, because I had someone who went to many healthcare providers and ended up driving from Pittsburgh to D.C. to get help. And I think that's because it's a health issue specific to women. But anything you might want to say about this, because it is prevalent.
Also did not know it was this prevalent. But broadly, I say, like, lack of consent and unwanted pain are the only two things that are not normal. And when people are experiencing pain, they should talk to a provider. I say that knowing it usually takes multiple attempts to find a provider who will take your pain seriously and know what to do about it. I will say that it's getting better, especially for affluent, educated white women, let's face it. If you're a woman of color, you're gonna have to go through more attempts to get your pain taken seriously in every domain of your well-being, but especially your sexual well-being, because systemic racism, sorry. But physical therapists in particular, pelvic floor physical therapists, are much more aware of the treatment options available around there are so many different reasons why people can experience pain with sex, and pain in their genitals. And when you can find someone who takes your pain seriously and knows that this diagnosis exists, there are treatments that exist that are available. It's spectacular to me that there's someone who has the resources to drive to frickin' DC from Pittsburgh to get that care, because not a lot of people do. And everybody deserves it.
Anything we haven't covered, besides the title of your new book, that you would like to add?
I feel like I have talked about a lot of difficult, like we've talked about some difficult things. I want to emphasize the last chapter of this book is about ecstatic pleasure on purpose, because if you're willing to go through the work of, going row by row through your garden and deciding what to keep and deciding what to chuck, it's effortful, but the reward is the kind of orgasms that turn the universe into rainbows. And even if you don't have those kinds of orgasms, you can have access to pleasure and joy and connection and love that is beyond what the cultural scripts that we grew up with ever mentioned was even possible. It is so worth it to co-create the sexual connection that is right for you and your partner or partners, and this relationship in this moment with these bodies as you are right now. It is 100% worth it. Even though I am perimenopausal and have long COVID, I've been following my own advice from this book, and things are better now than they have been in all of our 13 years together. They're not the same, but it's so much more playful, and we appreciate each other so much more.
I love that. I do. Remind people about the titles of your books, podcast, and website, and anything else you want them to track you down for.
So the first book, if you're like, I don't know where to begin around my sexuality, that's Come As You Are, the surprising new science that will transform your sex life. If you're like, I can't even get started with my sex life because I'm too stressed, overwhelmed, and exhausted, I wrote a book with my sister called Burnout, which is about stress management. And then the third book is about sex in long-term relationships, and it's called, and oh yeah, I was totally proud of myself when I thought of this title, Come Together.
I thought it was great.
I was like, oh, mic drop. I got it.
As we wrap up today's enlightening episode with the effervescent Emily, we want to extend a heartfelt thank you to our incredible guest for sharing her valuable insights and expertise with us. You can follow me on Instagram or Twitter at Rhoda on Couples, and I actually just signed up for TikTok. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, stay curious, stay open, and keep the conversation going.
Thank you for listening to What Healthy Couples Know That You Don't. If you have enjoyed the show, please leave a rating and review on iTunes and help get the word out. To learn more or connect with Rhoda, visit therapyideas.net.